So this chapter was all about how do we assess the skills that we're seeing in the class and how do we make sure our assessment lines up with our value system. So I actually hadn't ever thought of this until this summer when someone brought to my attention that even though I value a lot of those like 21st century competencies, I don't actually value them like subconsciously to the students because my assessments are still kind of based off of like your standard like KICA strategy. I did make my like investigation skills, connection skills, I do weight those higher than your knowledge skills, but even just having them there, I feel like means I still value knowledge and I really need to move away from that. And so what was really cool about this one was all about talking about like how do we assess students, what we assess students on, but more importantly, like how do you communicate that feedback to them? And so his team looked at a ton of different ways of giving information back to students. And they found similar research to what I have seen in the past, which is what pushed me to go gradeless, which is that as soon as there's a number or a letter on the piece of paper, they don't look at anything else or take anything else in. So if you're curious about like a gradeless classroom and things, that's a lot to unpack. And so I have another playlist about gradeless stuff that you can check out on my channel. And if you want more specific information about a certain thing, just let me know. So for this context, though, essentially what they're looking at is they are looking at like how do we communicate to students then without a number. And so they initially started using like a traditional rubric. So like 4 things across the top, like your levels, and then all of your standards down the side, and then your like standard like edgy speak where it's like usually, sometimes, rarely, like using that kind of language. And they found it was too nuanced and too many words, and the students get lost in it and don't really understand that standard like 16 by 16 full grid. So what they actually played around with and found was the most effective rubric was basically like a bulleted list on the like don'ts and a bulleted list on the do's, and do one thing per rubric. So essentially you're building a T-chart with a gap in the middle, and on the left is the things that you like, behaviors you don't want to do, and right is behaviors you do want to do. So for example, in the example they did in the book was a rubric on perseverance. So for example, giving up right away or as soon as it gets hard would be on your don't side, and then continuing to work through and struggle would be on the good side if you were going to grade perseverance. So essentially what they were looking at was rubrics with really minimal language, 5 quick and easy little like maximum points per thing on the good or the bad side, have them kind of mirror each other if you can. And then last but not least is don't put anything on the top. So just have an arrow like showing the continuum. So for example, instead of writing like level 1 to level 4, you would just have an arrow start at one end and then continue to the other end. Now, this is where I'm going to kind of deviate from what Peter has done here, because I actually have found that as soon as you give the students like an end to go to like finish at, they'll stop. And so I've added like a mastery level to my marking schemes. And so I'm more using like a level 3 standard is that you're achieving that skill and you've demonstrated that skill, but it mastery. So that means repeatability, high level, polished, nuanced answers, ability to teach other people, ability to communicate or justify your answers. Those kinds of higher level ordered thinking is what gets you into that mastering level. And that's where those 80s and 90 numbers come from. So I think what I'm going to do is going to be slightly different from what Peter did with the good and the bad, is I'm actually moving towards single point rubrics for this year. So I'll use the same kind of strategies, really simple language, 5 points, and then use those kind of continuums. So instead of my list being at the start and the end of the continuum, I'll have mine like 60, 70% of the way through the continuum and have that kind of like achieving list. So then kids can see where they are on that continuum. The other neat thing was that he pushed a lot of student voice in that. So an example would be when I do graphing, instead of me like telling them what I'm looking for in a graphs, give them 3 examples of past student graphs, one that has a lot of growth, one that's kind of in the middle, and one that would be maybe like a mastery level. And then have the students rank them and talk about ideas about what they like and don't like. And then using those, come up with the language then to put in your rubric as your look fors. So that was really cool because you can basically get students to input into what their mark's about, which gets them to buy in and gets them excited about it. But also then you are also to give them exemplars so they can kind of see where the continuum looks like, which I think is really important. So lots to unpack here. It was a massively awesome chapter. And if you're going to read one, I think that's the winner.